Q&A, and I'll have a microphone and I'll come to you when you have your question, okay?
Save all your questions to after the presentation.
After the presentation, yes, thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for inviting Bob and me to come out here this morning. I know that some of you have met Bob before. He was out here in October to talk about this project when some of the planning was still in very early stages. I'm Mary Ann Walsh. I'm the Science and Restoration Coordinator for the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays. That means that I'm in charge of the scientific research programs that we do there, the habitat restoration projects, things like reforesting, old agricultural properties, and putting in wetland restorations. We've created some rookeries for herons on Middle Island, so we do a lot of that type of project. We do oyster gardening and oyster shell recycling projects in the bays. Bob is actually in charge of both of those projects. So Bob Collins is our program manager. He works with me on a number of different types of projects, including the living shorelines and the oyster restoration projects that we have. So I'm hoping that I can answer a lot of the questions that you may have about this project today. I'm going to give a presentation that hopefully addresses many of the questions that have already been put to us. Barbara was very helpful in collating a lot of the questions that came in from many of you, so we tried to, as much as we could, to answer some of those. If we haven't addressed your questions, then I certainly invite you to talk to us about it after the presentation is done. We also put together several pages here with the important, pertinent information about this project, its cost, exactly what the role and responsibility of the community would be, and so forth, what the benefits of the project would be. I know that all the board members have a copy of this. We brought some extra copies, but certainly not enough to go around to everyone. So I'm hopeful that your board or Mike can make this available to you. We can get you additional hard copies, or perhaps could be posted on your website so that everybody can see it. Some of it I'm going to be talking about in the presentation here. So I want to start out by saying what the Center for the Inland Bays is, in case you aren't that familiar with us. We are not a government agency. We are not affiliated with the state government. We do get grant money from them to do projects and a lot of our work. We also get some grant money from the federal government. But we are a private, nonprofit organization. We're a charitable 501c3 organization. And we're one of 28 national estuary programs in the country. These programs were established back in the 80s and 90s when the Clean Water Act was enacted. They were established by Congress as organizations that would help clean up the water and improve habitat around the estuaries, the bays of national ecological significance. So the Delaware Inland Bays, Rehoboth Bay, Little Assateague Bay, Indian River Bay, that's the estuary called the Inland Bays. That is one of 28 estuary systems that Congress, several decades ago, decided was one of the most important places in the country to save and preserve and clean the water quality. So that's when our organization was established by an act of the state legislature, actually. Even though we're not a government agency, we are mandated to exist by the legislature. We were established back in the 90s. We've been in existence for over 20 years now, working to clean up the water quality and habitat in the bays. So this is our mission statement. This is what we do. We work to preserve, to protect, and restore the inland bays, all the water that flows into them, and the watershed around them. So that's water quality and habitat types of projects. The way we do that is through several different program areas. We do science and research. We help support university researchers who are doing projects to look at oyster reproduction in the bay, to look at ways to clean up the water, to monitor the water quality, to put out reports about where the bacteria are highest, all of that type of research that's very important to everyone who lives on the bays. We help to support that. We do habitat restoration projects, including wetlands and shorelines and reforestation, trying to introduce fish and oysters back into areas of the bays. We do some public policy work, and that is we provide information to decision makers and to residents of the watershed like you to help make good decisions about the water quality in the bays. So things like trying to advocate to get a little bit more money to do projects like the kinds that are needed here in SwannKeys. We worked with a state committee to improve the permitting process for living shorelines so that it's much easier. If a community now wants to do a living shoreline, they don't have to necessarily go through the months and months and large expense of doing the Army Corps of Engineer permits and state permits. There's now a more streamlined way to do that, and we helped advocate for that policy to let that happen. And we do a lot of education and outreach, working with communities like yours to do projects that you need, that you want, that address concerns of yours about water quality, but work with you on that to make sure that all of your concerns and needs are addressed. Here's an aerial shot of SwannKeys. You probably recognize your house there. Why are we so interested in this area? Well, that creek up there at the top of the picture, that's Garrettson Creek. I know that you're all familiar with it. The water from the creek flows into your canals. You, I'm sure, use the creek for recreation, for boating, for fishing, and we are very concerned as an organization about Garrettson Creek because it is one of the dirtiest creeks, tributaries in the inland bays. Many of our tributaries and canal systems are very polluted. About a year and a half or so ago, the Center for the Inland Bays started working with residents of the communities on Garrettson Creek, including a number of people who live here in SwannKeys, on a committee called the Garrettson Creek Team to try to identify the issues that were of biggest concern and try to strategize about some ways that the communities can work with us to get a little bit of motion on some of the things that need to be done to help clean up water quality. So SwannKeys is one of the most important communities on Garrettson Creek. It's one of the older communities. It doesn't have a lot of the stormwater treatment and more modern types of shoreline management that some of the newer communities do. So there are opportunities in SwannKeys to go back and do some retrofit work to help do some water quality, to address water quality issues in your canals. Here's a shot of Garrettson Creek from the Old Mill Bridge. It's a beautiful creek to kayak on, but I know that many of you are aware that the water quality in the creek is not always the greatest. And you deal a lot, I'm sure, with algae blooms in the summertime and in the spring. That's very typical of residential canal systems where the water is very poorly flushed. There are a lot of pollutants, excessive nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus coming from all different kinds of sources. In Garrettson Creek, the nitrogen and phosphorus are coming from the agricultural areas upstream. They flow into Garrettson Creek through tax ditches. There's also a lot of stormwater runoff, particularly from some of the developed areas along the waterfront. So these algae blooms are a big nuisance in communities like yours. There are also very high levels of bacteria associated with these polluted areas. And we did a report just this past year. It's a report we do every 5 years called The State of the Inland Bays. There are some copies of some of the summaries of what we found in that circulating around here. Available on our website. We can get you more copies of the magazine if you would like to have them. But one of the big messages that came out of that report, we took all of the scientific monitoring data that's available for Rehoboth Bay, Indian River Bay, and Little Assomption Bay, and the creeks that flow into them. We consolidated it all, analyzed it to look for what is the status of the water quality right now in all of our creeks and bays. And what is the trend? Are any of them getting better? Are some of them getting worse? Are we just sort of in a stagnant type of trend? One of the big messages that came through in the most recent report is that some of our open bay areas The last one bay is one of the places where we've seen a little bit of water quality improvement over the last 5 years, but only in the open water areas of the bays where you get more flushing. In places like Derrickson Creek and the residential canals here in SwannKeys, there's not that great of flushing action there to flush out the pollutants and improve the water quality, and the water quality is not getting better in those areas, unfortunately. So this is what you're dealing with in Derrickson Creek and the canals here. There's very high levels of nitrogen still. Some of that's coming from agriculture upstream, some of it's coming from roadway runoff and fertilizers that people are putting on their lawns. It's running directly into the creeks and canals. That's leading to algae blooms, which then deplete the oxygen in the water. It's not that uncommon to get fish kills in canals like this. Perhaps I've seen some of them here in SwannKeys to various degrees. It's very limiting to the amount of fish and shellfish that can survive in these canals. A lot of the underwater grasses and things that are needed by these fish and shellfish to survive have just gone away because of the pollution. And high bacteria counts are very typical of the canals and parts of Derrickson Creek. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of stories, perhaps you've experienced it yourself, infections that people get when they contact the water. The fact that you can't eat any of the shellfish that are harvested from this area because of the bacteria levels. I don't eat any of the fish that come out of this area. There aren't necessarily restrictions on them, but there are consumption advisories on many of the fish. So I know that we all, as residents of the Inland Bays watershed, have a very vested interest in doing whatever we can, even if it's small steps, to help clean up the water. So the thing that I'd like to talk to you about today, primarily, is shoreline management. This is the way that we typically manage erosion on the shorelines in the inland bays. Bulkheads, and we either bulkhead, put up seawalls, or we throw rock on the shore to help prevent erosion. So what's wrong with that? Well, what happens when you sever the connection between the water and the shore with a bulkhead, as you can see here, is that a really critical zone between the water and the upland area is eliminated. That little transition, intertidal area, that's where the critters live. I mean, these are the creatures like fish, shrimp, blue crabs. They require that intertidal zone to reproduce, to get food. Birds, water birds like herons, egrets, they stopped using these areas so much. There's actually a banner that I saw recently that said, "Birds boycott bulkheads." Because they need to eat the fish and the crabs and the shrimp that are living in these intertidal areas that have gone away because we put in these rocks and the bulkheads. These bulkheads also create erosion problems that weren't there before. I've noticed walking around your lagoon out here that you have some erosion starting behind the bulkhead. That's very typical. When the water goes over the bulkhead, it starts scouring out soil behind the bulkhead. That also happens in front of the bulkhead in the water. You may not be able to see it, but when waves hit the bulkhead, they reflect off of it and then start scouring sediment. That's why the underwater grasses and the seaweeds and things that are needed by the fish aren't there anymore. They've been eroded away because of the wave energy against the bulkhead. So what we're trying to advocate for, I put this in here to remind me to say that I know that jellyfish are an issue in many of the canals around here. There was a study done in the Chesapeake Bay recently that demonstrated that jellyfish populations are much higher in areas that have bulkheads. And the reason for that is that one of the parts of the jellyfish life cycle has to attach to a hard surface. It's a little polyp. And that little jellyfish polyp grows up attached to a bulkhead or a rock or a hard surface, and then it eventually, when it becomes an adult, lets go and becomes a floating jellyfish. But in areas that have a lot of hard surfaces like bulkheads, you get a lot of jellyfish growing on them, little baby jellyfish. There's actually a program now in the Chesapeake Bay that encourages communities like yours to go around and clean the baby jellyfish off the bulkheads to try to reduce the populations. So what we're trying to advocate for in the inland bays, and we're working with a number of different partners throughout the state, including sister nonprofit organizations like the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, the Nature Conservancy, the DEMREX Division of Watershed Stewardship is an active player on this. We are working on a Living Shoreline initiative to try to use more nature-based ways to stabilize shorelines. Now, this is not a new, thank you. This is not a new type of technology. This is something that people have been doing for the last decade or more. And it's being done more and more all around the country. There actually are many states in the country now, including Maryland and Virginia, that require communities that are going to do replacement of bulkheads or installation of new bulkheads to demonstrate that they cannot use a living shoreline before they will approve the permit for the bulkhead. So they're requiring use of living shoreline techniques any place that it's feasible. We don't have that in Delaware, but we're trying to get more information out to residents of the watershed about these types of new nature-based techniques so that people can voluntarily choose to do these types of techniques when you have to do replacement or new installation of shoreline management. So what these living shorelines are we use native plants and coconut core fiber logs, stone, oyster shells, nature-based materials, natural materials, wooden logs in some places, to create structures that stabilize the shoreline against erosion just as effectively, in most cases, as bulkheads or riprap, but they maintain the ecological function of that shoreline. We still have some of that intertidal area there where the fish and the crabs and the shrimp and the water birds can continue to grow and feed. So here are some of the benefits of living shorelines. And there are many different types of living shorelines. They're all very place-specific. But all of them are nature-based. That is, they use natural materials and techniques that are designed to encourage fish and shellfish and so forth to live there. They do provide erosion and storm protection. They're designed by engineers carefully for each specific site, taking into account the wave energy that's at that site and the storm energy and so forth. So they're designed to provide protection against those storms and erosion. A lot of these living shorelines have been put in the last few years in New Jersey in response to the Hurricane Sandy that hit them so hard up there. There was a lot of federal money available after the storm to rebuild things. And many of the New Jersey communities started working with organizations like ours to put living shorelines in instead of replacing bulkheads. Some of that work had actually started before the hurricane hit, so there were living shorelines existing on the Jersey shore. When the hurricane hit, there's a great picture. I wish I could have found it in time to put it in this presentation. There is a picture of a living shoreline right next door to a bulkheaded property. The living shoreline, after Hurricane Sandy hit it directly, was just fine. The house that was behind that shoreline was intact. The property right next door to it, the bulkhead had crumbled and the house had disappeared. Right next door to one another. So, just because this is a softer way of armoring the shore, it doesn't mean that it's an ineffective way. It doesn't necessarily make intuitive sense to us because we always think harder is better. But that's not necessarily true when you're protecting against waves and storms. So the other big benefit is that these shorelines can help filter pollutants because they have plants, they have shellfish, they allow binding of pollutants like nitrogen and phosphorus to the sediment that's there. This is a benefit that doesn't happen at all in bulkheaded and riprap shores. Provide spawning areas, feeding areas for fish, crabs, and they help preserve some of the wetlands because we usually have a certain portion of the shoreline planted in wetland plants. So our Living Shoreline Initiative, of which the Center for the Inland Bays is a part, is designed to get information out to residents of our watershed, to do projects with communities to help maximize the use of these new, modern living shoreline techniques. in our watershed. So we provide education and outreach. We work with a lot of other partners in the state on this. We also are training marine contractors, landscape architects, consulting firms on how to do these techniques, because for many firms, these are fairly new. They haven't necessarily seen them done in other places, so they don't know a lot about them and how to design them correctly. And yet, if you want to replace your bulkhead or put in a new bulkhead, you're going to call one of these guys. You're going to call a marine contractor and say, what can you do for my shore? So we want the marine contractors to have these techniques in their toolbox so that they can offer you the option. Say, okay, well, we could put in a bulkhead, but we could also do it this way. And I have experience doing this. So we've been doing a number of these contractor trainings. I mentioned earlier that we're working on with the state to make it easier to permit these types of projects. The state actually, for a while, had some financial incentives, a cost share. Anytime you apply for a living shoreline permit, you got $5,000. I'm not sure that that's still funded at the moment. The state budget is suffering a little bit. And then the big, one of the big, most important parts of our initiative is that we're trying to create something on the order of 6 to 8 demonstration living shoreline projects in the inland bays. And why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that because when communities like yours are considering putting in a different type of shoreline management alternative, a living shoreline, or a private homeowner wants to do it on their shoreline, one of the first questions that they always ask, and I've heard it from your community too, is where can we go to see one of these? Because we're not familiar with it. Well, there aren't that many of them in our watershed right now. So there aren't local projects that you can go and see. There aren't communities that you could go and talk to say, you know, what was your experience with this? And we feel like building a few of these demonstration projects is really important. We're putting a lot of effort and, into finding funding to make this happen, to work with communities so that we can meet the community needs, but also have this great demonstration project that in the future, if a community like yours says, well, we'd like to think about a living shoreline, but we really want to see what another community's experience was, well, there would be that project there that you can look at and talk about. We can also use these demonstration projects as a training tool for contractors, because we're going to be hiring local contractors to come in and help us with these projects. When we do our training sessions, we can bring them out to look at the sites and talk about how each one of the projects was done. So in order to create these 6 or 8 living shoreline projects, we actually went through a process, which some of you heard about last fall. We got a grant from the state to do a big planning report where we used computer software, mapping tools, and worked with the consulting firm, Sovereign Consulting Inc., to screen the entire inland bays watershed, the shorelines all along all 3 bays. And we pinpointed around 85 places in the inland bays that could potentially be used for a living shoreline demonstration project. And then we went through another big process of prioritizing sites. What are the criteria we're looking for? We wanted to choose sites that could demonstrate different types of energy regimes. Like we wanted high energy sites with big waves and a lot of exposure to storm. We wanted lower energy sites like a canal or further up a creek. We wanted to be able to demonstrate different types of tactics. We wanted some places where we could incorporate some shellfish reefs. We wanted some places where we could use logs or stone fill or something like that. We wanted, really wanted to try to find a place that would allow us to do a retrofit of an existing bulkhead. So there aren't very many places, certainly around here, to see that right now. And that's where a lot of communities like yours are right now. They're having to replace aging infrastructure, and in order to make the decision about it, they'd like to be able to see an example of a bulkhead that was replaced. So we did, after that whole 6-month process, come up with what we felt were the top 6 sites. And in this process, we talked to communities, talked to property owners, got some interest from some of them. We spoke to a number of people in SwannKeys. Some of the residents of your community had expressed interest in improving water quality and perhaps doing some work to replace the bulkhead out here in the lagoon. So we chose our final 6 sites. SwannKeys was one of those that came up to the top. So why SwannKeys? Well, it's on Derrickson Creek. We are very concerned about the water quality in Derrickson Creek and have done a lot of community outreach to try to address that. Your community, SwannKeys, is concerned about the water quality. We know that because a lot of you have come and talked to us about it. Your bulkhead currently needs to be replaced. So this provides an opportunity perhaps to do a portion of it as a different type of tactic, a more nature-based tactic, and demonstrate that technique. So this is kind of a unique opportunity. You have to replace your bulkhead. We have the opportunity to get grant funds that are specifically targeted to this type of project, and we could save you money. We could protect your shoreline out here in the lagoon. We could do a great demonstration project for the whole watershed, and we could end up saving your community money on it at the same time. And then after it's done, other communities like yours will have something to look at. They'll be able to talk to you about what your experience was. So we worked during that planning process with the firms of RK&K Engineering and Sovereign Consulting, Inc. to come up with concept designs for each of the 6 sites that we chose. And I just want to emphasize these are concept designs. We know that once we get to the point where we build these projects, we're going to have to do a lot more back and forth with the community to make sure that the community gets what it needs as well as us. So the goal of the concept design for SwannKeys that was presented was to do a nature-based retrofit of at least one side of the one bulkhead side of your marina out here, preferably at least 2, but at least 1. We know that the design has to meet SwannKeys' needs for access to the lagoon and for however you use it the most. So that's where we need a lot of input from you as we go to a final design type of process. We know that you have stormwater concerns in your community. There's an opportunity to provide a small amount of stormwater treatment from the parking area and the roadways here and incorporate that into the living shoreline as well, so kind of 2 birds with 1 stone. And we know that your community is very concerned about the look of this, as you should be, as all communities would be. And I've driven around SwannKeys a number of times. It's very clear that everyone here is very attentive to their property and their yards. It's a beautiful little community, and we really appreciate that. We know that whatever is done here in the lagoon is going to have to look nice. It's going to have a manicured landscape type of look, because that's, I'm sure, what you would prefer based on what I see in the rest of your community. And we would make sure that that happens. We think that this could become an amenity for your community. If this ends up having more of a garden type look, we could incorporate things like a pavilion or a kayak launch or walkways, anything that you feel would be an improvement to the way that you use this area, that could be incorporated into this design. And we know that whatever the design is, finally, it has to be resilient, it has to last for a long time, and it has to be low maintenance for you, because I know that you, like everybody else, you don't have a lot of money to maintain. So that was all taken into consideration here. So again, these are concepts. If we choose to go forward with this project with you, we would work with you to make sure that your concerns and your needs are addressed in the final design. So just keep that in mind as I show you the pictures of the concepts, because this is just, there is a lot of adjustment that can be made. So there were several different alternatives proposed. The main idea was that the bulkhead on a side of the lagoon would be removed, and then there would be some grading of the shoreline from the top of the slope down into the water. Now, depending on whether we put this all the way back into the existing grass areas and then grade down from there, or if we grade, if we push it a little bit more into the water so that you have more grass area left, both of those things can be done. It affects the cost because the further you push it into the water, the more fill you have to bring in. But it can be adjusted back and forth to retain as much or as little of the grassy areas as you need. So the idea is to establish in those areas a narrow band of marsh, basically a wetland garden on that slope. And the base of the slope would be stabilized with oyster shells and stone rubble, coconut core fiber matting, and logs, all very securely anchored. And then plants would be put into the sloped area to help stabilize and prevent erosion of the soil there. And the idea is that we would plant primarily native plants, but we can incorporate more color and different types of looks of plants into this with your help. We have a vision that we probably bring in a horticulturist or a landscape architect to help work with you on that so that you get the kind of look that you need. We're not thinking anything like messy marsh stuff here. So this previous one, I know you can't see it very well from way back there, but this one has more of the marsh band into the grassy area just outside of the Civic Association here. This next one has it pushed a little bit more into the water. It could be pushed even further there. This is a concept where we do two sides, so a little bit narrower band on the side and then a little bit wider band of plants closer to the community center here. We also had an architect do a rendering of what it would look like, just an artist rendition of it. So this is the existing view of what's out there now. And then this is what we envision it would look like. So this is two sides, the top side there and the left side, a narrow band of wetland plants. We can incorporate more colorful plants into it if you like. This is an illustration of what it would look like just with the Spartina marsh cordgrass planted. So here's a more eye-level view of it. This is the existing condition, and this is what it might look like with the band of marsh there. One thing I want to point out is that the edge between the grassy areas and this band of marsh would be very neat. There would be a very clear defined line there so that you can easily mow up to it. It will not inhibit your maintenance in terms of mowing or anything like that. We really don't anticipate that the marsh area would need much maintenance. Maybe picking up a little trash that might get stuck in there after a storm. You probably already have to pick up trash in areas. Might have to replace a few plants here and there over the years. That's natural in any garden. So that's the main maintenance that we would anticipate. So again, here's an aerial view of the grassy area just out front of the community center here. And we had a discussion at one point about the possibility, if the community is interested in it, of making this a little bit more of a park-like area. That's possible. If you have an interest in that, we could put in some bike areas, a picnic pavilion, a kayak launch, whatever you might like. But that's something that would be entirely up to the community, but we could build that into the design of the project and the grant request. So again, native plants would be used, at least primarily native plants, and we would choose those with you to get the kind of look that you could live with. So I wanted to show you a few examples because if you go online and look at living shorelines, do a search on Google, you'll come up with pictures of primarily marsh areas, out on bays, areas that are a little bit more like the marsh you have out here on Derrickson Creek. It's hard for those pictures to envision what something out here might look like in the lagoon because that's a more urban type of setting, if you will. So I tried to find a few pictures just on the internet of some places that have done something like this. This is in Brooklyn. This is a drawing, but they did a living shoreline along the river there where they have the nice walkways and the seating and a very neat manicured area here along the shore that they built up with oyster shells and wetland plants like the type that we would use in your living shoreline. So you can see this is really neat, well manicured. Here's another one from another area. I think this is in Brooklyn somewhere too, but how they integrated the living shoreline into their bike path area and their walkways and their piers. This is an area that was planted entirely in the marsh cordgrass, the Spartina. A little bit less of a defined area between the upland and the living shoreline area, but you can see that once the grass grows up, it has a nice, neat look. Some examples where people have incorporated flowers into the living shorelines. Here's some pickerelweed with purple flowers. This is in a place that had a rocky shoreline, but they incorporated a number of different flowers and ferns and things into that. This is a living shoreline that had cardinal flower and other types of colorful flowering plants incorporated. So what I'm trying to demonstrate with this is that we can create a type of situation that looks more garden-like for you, that really is an amenity for your community here. So, cost. Now don't let these numbers frighten you, because this is the total cost of the project that would be covered primarily by grant funds. I know that currently you have to replace your bulkhead. You've got some estimates of at least $20,000 per side, perhaps a total cost of $67,000 to $70,000 to replace the bulkhead all around. In order to do the type of project we envision, we would be looking at a cost of $85,000 to $120,000, something like that, for the whole project to cover engineering costs, design, materials, construction, everything. But SwannKeys would only be responsible for a very small portion of this, because the Center for the Inland Bays will apply for grant money to cover the majority of that cost. So one of the grant programs that we have been very successful in getting in past years for projects like this is called the Community Water Quality Improvement Grant. It's a state of Delaware grant, and you can request up to $75,000, and it requires a 25% match, which is pretty low compared to many other grants. There are other grant programs out there that might be possible for this that have even more money available. So we would need a little bit of match money on that, and here's some things that I'm going to throw out as possible ideas. We talked about a small amount of money, perhaps coming from the SwannKeys Civic Association, maybe $10,000 of the money that you normally would spend toward your bulkhead replacement. So that's $10,000 instead of $20,000 to $70,000. Maybe you have some landscaping funds or maintenance funds that could be devoted to buying some plants or something for this, or maintaining the plants. I'm not sure, that's something that you could talk about as a community. But we're talking about a small amount of money from the community. The rest of the matching funds would come from the grant request. It could come from state legislators. Each of your state legislators has discretionary money that they can put into projects like this. So you may want to talk to Ron Gray, Gerald Hocker, some of the county council people to see if there might be a little bit of money that they would be willing to put toward a project in your community. I've talked to DelDOT about possibly donating some of the materials, and if they're available, they're in favor of that. Some of the stone rubble that might be needed to stabilize the living shoreline, they have a lot of that sitting around the maintenance yards. They might be willing to donate it and truck it. That could all be used to offset the cost. Volunteer labor. We have lots of sources of volunteers to come in and help with the work. We can use volunteers from your community if they're available. And there might be other grants that we can use to match this one as well. It's all about timing and strategy and working with you and our other partners. I have a project just recently that DENREC just decided they had additional wetlands money this year, so they wanted to put an additional $30,000 into it. So that really helped offset the cost of the project. So again, we're looking at the potential for actually saving your community money because you would not have to bear the full brunt of the cost of bulkhead replacement. So finally, I want to talk a little bit more about what the roles and responsibilities would be. So what is CIB committing to do? What would we get out of that? And then what would your community have to do? What would we expect from you? So the Center for the Inland Bays would be responsible for coordinating all of the different people who have to come together to make a project like this happen. So that's your community, it's the grant agencies, state or federal grant agencies, foundations, whoever we're applying to. It would be any subcommittees that you might have, perhaps your environmental subcommittee. It would perhaps be other members of the State Shoreline Initiative, the State Shoreline Initiative. We would also, as an organization, identify grant opportunities for you. And then we would write the grant proposals. We know how to do that. We've done it a lot. We've been successful in getting over $1 million in grant money for community projects like this over the last 6 or 7 years. So we would do all of that work, but we would need your input on it and your assistance. We would, if we get the grant, we would develop the contracts with consultants, construction companies if needed. We would manage those contracts, so none of that would be on you. We would also be sure to keep you informed all the time about any progress, any issues or problems that arise. So that would be my role. We would act as the interface with the granting organization if they have questions or concerns about how the money is being spent. And we would commit to monitor this living shoreline after it's constructed for at least a couple of years. Typically, these grant awards are for 2 years. And so during that whole time, we'll continually monitor what's happening there. Once it's put in, we'll keep track of any issues that are arising, any maintenance needs that might pop up in the future. And we'll probably also monitor it at least once a year after that, because we're interested in knowing how is this working. We want it to work. So we would commit to doing that monitoring. And we would also do public outreach about this. That's a big part of our mission. We want other communities to know about the demonstration projects that we build. So we would write articles for our Inland Bays Journal. We might put some things on our Facebook page about it. We generally talk to reporters, Cape Gazette, local papers around here about projects we're doing. So your community would get some publicity out of this. So what would be your role as a community? We need you to provide us with the information that's required to do the design and the installation. So we'll have our engineering firms sit down with you and with me and with Bob and talk as a group about what do you need. What are your biggest concerns? What are the things that you can live with? What are the things you absolutely don't want? Let's make sure we do the design so that you're happy with it. That's very important. So we would need you to also contribute at least a small amount of cash toward the match of the grant. We've talked previously about something in the area of $10,000, but we can negotiate that a little bit depending on what your abilities to pay as a board are. We would need you to allow this to serve as a demonstration site. So a few times a year, we might want to bring a tour group through to look at the living shoreline to see what's possible in retrofitting the bulkhead. We have trainings for marine contractors once or twice a year. We may want to bring them by to see the completed project and stand on the shoreline and talk about it, perhaps ask you questions about your experience with it. So we would need you to agree to do that. And I want to emphasize that once this project was completed with the grant money, you own it. It's your property. We can't tell you what to do with it. We can't force you to do anything particular with it for the next 5, 10, 20 years. It's your property. Now, we hope that it will be something that you love, that works well for you, that you will continue to maintain. We will have to develop some sort of maintenance agreement with SwannKeys that says SwannKeys understands that this is our project, that we are responsible for doing maintenance on it, if it needs new plants or additional work. But it is your property. Center for the Inland Bays can't tell you what to do with it in the future. DNREC can't tell you what to do with it in the future. It is your property. So we've talked about some of this, what would be the benefits to you. You would get long-term protection of the shoreline, similar to what you've gotten with the bulkhead, perhaps even better. We want this to end up being an environmentally friendly, aesthetically pleasing amenity for your community. We think it's going to be cost-effective for your community because of the possibility of grant funding. And this will be good publicity for your community. It will be one of the stars of the Garrison Creek area, one of the more environmentally responsible communities here. And we know that you're very concerned about water quality and want to do some things to help improve it. So I'm going to just finish with 2 or 3 slides of another set of projects that we did. Because some of you asked, well, has the Center for the Inland Bays ever done this with other communities? We're working with, I think, 5 other communities right now on living shoreline demonstration projects, and we're in the same stage of doing them pretty much that we are with you. We just submitted 2 grant proposals for 2 projects in Dewey Beach. We've been working with the town of Dewey Beach on living shoreline demonstrations for a little bit. We just submitted 2 enormous grants to build those. We're working with the Bayfront at Rehoboth, on Rehoboth Bay, down in Angola Neck, and with VFW at Quillen Point, with the Angola by the Bay community on Heron Creek, to do the same sort of thing. And we're talking to their community, just like I'm talking to you. We're talking about developing grant proposals and budgets and designs. But a place where we've done a lot of work in the past is the town of South Bethany. In 2008, the town started working with the Center for the Inland Bays and with DelDOT to do stormwater improvements within the community, particularly along Highway 1, because they were very concerned. They're a canal community like you. They have the same algae blooms and bacteria, and they really wanted to clean up the canals. So the Center for the Inland Bays wrote grant proposals to implement, I think, a total of 5 different stormwater projects along the medians on Highway 1. If you drive down there, you'll see currently a lot of rain gardens with beautiful plantings in them. That was all done by the Center for the Inland Bays with grant support and help from the town. There are swales on either side of the highway that were retrofitted into stormwater controls. So here's one of the swales in front of Sea Colony, the big high-rises down there on Highway 1. This is what it looked like before, just sort of an ugly little rain capture swale. This is what it looks like now. It's a beautiful little wet stormwater pond. We brought in Dr. Sue Martin from the University of Delaware Horticulture Department. She helped the town choose plantings for it. So they got a lot of beautiful plants that have become an amenity for their bike path and walkway there. The town and the Sea Colony residents love it. We're working with them on a project currently to put in a bigger stormwater pond along the highway. And they're putting in $150,000 of their money to work with us because of the past success that we had on these other projects. Here's another view of the final project. So this is what we're hoping we can help you do here in SwannKeys. So I'm sure that I haven't answered all the questions. Bob and I will answer as many questions as we can. If we are not able to answer some of your questions, we're happy to go back and find the answers and get them to you later. So that's what I have.
Thank you. Question?
I'm Diane Barrett. 2 questions. I'm glad to hear jellyfish could go down because of less bulky. But what about mosquitoes? And my other question is, what do you advise us to use in place of Roundup?
Well, Bob can probably answer the pesticide question better than I can. In terms of mosquitoes, of course, this project will only be working on one small area of your lagoon out here, but In these types of projects, we tend to see mosquitoes go down, and the reason for that is that the small fish start coming into the project, and they eat mosquito larvae. I used to work for DelDOT in their stormwater section, and my section was responsible for maintaining all of the stormwater ponds that the state owns. There was a big question about mosquito breeding in those stormwater ponds, so we actually hired an entomologist, a bug scientist, to do some research on that, and he discovered that in ponds that are well maintained, that allow the little fish to grow and get in between the plants, that there were no mosquitoes in those ponds. It was the ponds that were choked with Phragmites and that weren't maintained, that didn't drain well, those were the ones that had mosquitoes. So we would anticipate that as long as this is maintained and allow the fish and so forth to come into the plants, you would probably certainly have no increase in mosquitoes, maybe even a little bit of a decrease. I'll let Bob address the pesticide question.
Thanks. Right now, there's really not much of a substitute for Roundup in aquatic situations. In the landscape situation, there are a couple of organics that are, it's a citronella type product, but right now there's not a lot of good answers on that.
Dan Lorette is my name. The question I have is, the areas look beautiful after you've got done with them, but I didn't hear anything about the results of putting these in. You've seen a change, you've seen the bacteria drop. I didn't hear any of that going on in those areas that you had.
Well, there aren't a whole lot of these projects in our local area right now. And demonstration projects like this address a small portion of a canal or a small portion of shoreline. So trying to show an impact on the entire bay from one small project is pretty impossible. But we are doing some, we plan to do monitoring of all of the demonstration projects that we put in so that we can try to get some of that information. One of the projects that we're trying to design right now at Enville by the Bay provides an opportunity to incorporate activated charcoal into the living shoreline. And there's been some research in agricultural settings and in stormwater controls that this activated charcoal can help pull out nutrients like excess phosphorus and nitrogen and help stem algae blooms due to that. But it's never been tried in a brackish water setting like a living shoreline. So we're intending to do that and do the monitoring to demonstrate, does it work or doesn't it work? The work that we did in South Bethany on the stormwater controls, there was a lot of monitoring done at the outfall from that whole drainage area right before these controls were put in. We're completing the last project of this whole set of projects right now. It should be done sometime in 2018, the big stormwater pond. And after that's over, our intent is to go back and monitor that same outfall again after we've treated the entire drainage area with stormwater controls to be able to demonstrate the difference. So that's the best that I can answer that right now. We know that on a larger scale, if people were to adopt this, there would be a difference. That's been shown in other areas in the Chesapeake Bay, for example, but in this area, we just don't have enough of these projects to get that kind of data.
Okay, thank you. The second question that I have is, there's a lot of people in here that have concerns about the grass area that we have out there and the loss of it. Okay, because as you can see around here, we have a beautiful community center, but we have no parking around here. So a lot of people are looking maybe in the future about using that area for parking or whatever. So we don't want to lose any of that real estate that we have. Have you ever considered in your decision making whether maybe you just do the two rights, the right and the left side, rather than to do the front of the community?
That is a possibility. The other possibility is that we could push that marsh, that band of marsh, further into the water to preserve the grassy area right out front here. That would increase the total cost of the project somewhat because we would have to bring in more fill, but it would be just as effective. And so the question then would become, if we want to do that, if we want to preserve all of that grass area, can we find a grant with a sufficient funding amounts to cover that extra cost? Or can we get somebody like DelDOT to donate more of the fill for us so that we could offset that cost? But yes, it is possible that we could do just one or two of the sides, or we could design it so that less of that grass area is impacted. That's something that we would have to decide in conjunction with you. So some really hard discussions about what your future needs are for that, and what you can live with and what you can't.
I'm Ronnie Young, I'm the president of SwannKeys. And I have a couple questions. You're doing it to a marina. It's not going to affect the rest of SwannKeys. It's not going to help any of the other lagoons. And Denbreck has already said that our lagoons are deeper than Dickerson Creek is, and the water flow is very, very slow, so it's not going to change. The tide goes down every 6 hours, so it's going to take the clean water out, the dirty water is going to come back in. We're not benefiting anything.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with some of what you say. This project at the end of this canal is not going to clean up the water in all SwannKeys canals. It won't even clean up all the water in that particular canal. It will help a little bit. And part of this is a demonstration project. So we're trying to show some ways that this kind of work could be done on a larger scale in the future. Some of the benefits that you will see are an increase in the fish and the crabs and so forth that use that area. You may see more birds like egrets and herons coming in. So it definitely will improve the habitat for life in that area. In terms of cleaning up all the canals and Dickerson Creek, I'm not going to lie to you, it's not one small project like this is not going to do that. More projects like that over future years could, potentially. It all helps. There's not one silver bullet on this, unfortunately.
The other question is, and like Danny was saying, out in front in Dickerson Creek, that's where the things need to be done to protect our whole community. Over the last storms, all that grass is almost gone. Doing what we're doing here is not going to help at all. We need the grant to do the things out in the front to protect the whole community. And there's been a lot of talk about $67,000 to replace our bulkheads. Our bulkheads don't need to be replaced right now. We have the money to take care of them. They do not need to be replaced yet. They might need in another 5 or 10 years, but not now.
Okay, well, let me address the first part of your question. I understand some of the issues that you're having out there near the creek. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. The particular grant opportunity and project opportunity that we have right now, that my organization is working on, is these demonstration projects. The area out by the creek, we looked at that. We decided that that did not fit our needs for a demonstration project. There are some other areas that are doing projects similar to that that can serve as demonstrations already for that type of work. It's a much bigger project. There are a lot of issues there. They're going to have to bring in the state and the Army Corps and a lot more complications. The other issue is that the grant opportunities that we have right now are for these demonstration projects, like out here in the lagoon. Those types of grants aren't necessarily available for that work. There are other grants that could be applied for to do that type of work. And I know that you had put in some grant proposals a couple of years ago, I think, to address that, to address some of your stormwater issues, and I highly encourage all of that. This particular opportunity is just targeted to projects like out here at the lagoon, our demonstration projects. And I understand that in terms of the big picture, it's not going to address some of your biggest issue items for your community, but it's an opportunity to do something and get some money that would pay for it. that's the best that I can answer your question on that. Yes, sir.
Bill Hutchison, Mallard Drive. On page 35, you and I had, of your brochure, you and I had a little discussion before the meeting, where you showed and you used eelgrass conditions for your measured parameters. The input into Derrickson is all the way down at the far west end where you can't go beyond the bridge. Beyond the ridge. The water quality there is, to use your own words, not even close, very, very poor. If that's what's constantly coming in, and I applaud everything that you present. I understand the longest journey, smallest step, so forth. But can you address what's being done, what's being looked at to staunch the flow coming in, as opposed to going individual projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, our inland bays, all three of the bays have big issues that are not easily addressed. Derrickson Creek in particular has a large agricultural land use area out in the headwaters of the creek. A lot of farms and poultry houses and so forth out there. Much of the runoff from those areas flows through tax ditches and eventually into Derrickson Creek. So that's a big source of nitrogen and phosphorus that's causing algae blooms in the creek and in your canals. There are also inputs from the developed areas, from roadways, from parking lots, from subdivisions, people putting a lot of fertilizer on their lawns, and that running off into the canals and creeks as well. There is a lot of work going on all throughout the Inland Bays watershed, including in the Derrickson Creek watershed, to address some of this. We've been working with the Department of Agriculture, trying to make them responsible for doing the things that they've promised over the years in terms of forcing farmers to use cover crops, to follow their nutrient management plans. We work closely with the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Ag on that. In fact, both of those organizations, the secretaries, sit on our board of directors. So there are always discussions in those meetings about, okay, what is the Department of Ag doing? What is DNREC doing to address this? Yeah, these are long-term fixes. They're going to take not just a lot of effort, but a lot of money to address. And there's, the state and the local communities have to be willing to, hold everyone's feet to the fire on this. It's a long-term process, but we are addressing that. We have a big outreach program to communities on proper fertilizer use. We are a partner on what's called the Delaware Livable Lawns Initiative to do outreach to teach people how to apply the lawn fertilizer correctly and at the right time and in the right amounts. Because we've demonstrated that is a big problem in some of the developed areas. Everybody wants to live on the water. Who doesn't? But and we all want nice lawns. But there are ways to fertilize our lawns so that it doesn't run off into the creeks and cause algae blooms. All I can say is that there are a lot of different partners working to find money and find the will to address some of these other issues. But it depends not just on money, but also on people like you standing up and speaking up to the decision makers. This is a problem in my community and I want to address in some way. Thank you for asking that question.
My name is Tom Nocello, and you talked about a hardscape, bulkheads that we have throughout here. Has anybody recommendations that you can offer to someone in a small canal like we have, narrow canal like we have, to not have bulkheads? Because we'd all have that same problem with the growth of different stuff. I don't see a solution for that.
Right, and I hope that I wasn't misleading about that. We're not necessarily advocating that all bulkheads and riprap areas be removed. That's not feasible. It's not at all practical. What we're advocating is that in places where it can be done successfully, and there's money to do it, and willingness to do it on the part of the property owners, we would like to see people use these more modern, softer armoring tactics. There are going to be some areas that are really super high energy that It's just never going to be practical to use a living shoreline. And there are many existing communities like yours that have lots and lots of bulkheads. We have over 26 miles of canals in the Inland Bays watershed. It's 26 miles of canals times 2 each side. So that's, 50 miles of bulkhead, just in the canals alone. We're not going to be able to replace all of those. We're not even envisioning that. But there are places like marinas where we can do that kind of work.
Now, my big concern for SwannKeys, and there's a lot of talk, and this may be a question for just our board, is if we only do one side or two sides of the marina, the remaining bulkhead that remain in place, how long does it take to establish that living shoreline?
Typically, it takes about a year to get really good plant growth. It's like any garden, when you first put it in, the plants are small, so it takes a season at least for them to grow up. We have experience doing this in some other areas. Typically, we plant in the early spring, and usually by August or so, we have full growth of grass. So there does have to be some stabilization in there with some matting and so forth to avoid erosion until those plants grow up.
So with that being said, the remaining bulkhead, when a contractor does come in and we do need new bulkheads or repair those bulkheads, my concern is we still would have that in our budget, which isn't your concern, and also like the disturbance of the shoreline due to the fact that they have to come in afterwards to replace it.
That's a good question. Someone had posed that question, perhaps it was you previously, and that question had been forwarded to me. I talked to the consulting firm who did this concept design and asked that question, and he says he does not anticipate any impact on the living shoreline. He says it's been done in other places. He says that in this particular spot, he doesn't see any way that it could adversely impact it.
Thank you very much. Very informative.
My name's Glenn Bidwell, I'm off of Bluebell. This all sounds great, but to me it sounds like, we got to put initial cost, SwannKeys has to put initial cost down. Then it's going to cost us more money in the long run after you all are out of here. To me, it sounds like, from what you were describing with the algae growth and all that, we need to open up, because I know on both sides of Bluebell, both canals on both sides, on each side, we get no water flow. These canals need to be opened up. If nothing else, move the marsh at the end of our canals and transplant them elsewhere. That makes more sense to me than what you're planning on doing here. You need to start there before you start here.
Yeah, again, in terms of long-term improvement of water quality in your canals, this small demonstration project, the intention of it is not to be the silver bullet that cleans up your canals. I completely agree with you that there are bigger issues in all of the canal systems throughout the Inland Bays that need to be addressed. The town of South Bethany's been working on this for years now. They hired engineers to do flushing studies. They put in aerators and fountains and found that they had no impact. They've worked with us on stormwater projects, which do seem to be having some impact. But they understand the same thing, that they've got these long, sinewy networks of canals. There's very little that can be done to improve flushing there unless you open them up in some way. And now we're talking about an enormous engineering project, which I agree would probably be an excellent project to do. I'm not sure how it would get accomplished, but just again to reiterate that the purpose of this particular project that we're proposing is to do a trial, a demonstration of a way to retrofit bulkheads that could be used in other areas of your community or in other canal communities like yours throughout the Inland Bays. The intent of this small project is not to clean up all of the water in your canals. That's a much bigger project for us. But I appreciate your comment. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for being here, taking time out this morning for a beautiful presentation.
You're welcome.
People that know me, I am a board member, but no way do I represent the board. I'm speaking as a property owner. I said, what a great concept we have. It would be so nice to have something like that out in that lagoon or marina. I think long term, it will save us money, and I think it would increase the property values in SwannKeys, and it would be lovely to have something like that in our community. I want to thank you again.
Thank you, I appreciate that feedback.
I just want to let you all know with regard to long-term projects and headwaters in SwannKeys, I'm a part of a larger group that's working with Rob Arlett and Ron Gray and Gerald Hopper, and we are going to work with DENREC. We have a new secretary of DENREC to see what can be done across the board by bringing in businesses, farmers, all the residents along our waterway. We're going to have a forum that will be announced publicly in the newspapers. We'll make sure it's on next door. But we are going to create a forum to try to work together to see what we can do to, one, decrease runoff from all the development that is going on in our watershed that's increasing pollution in our water. And number two, what we can do, and the state knows this, what we can do to decrease the pollution that's coming from the hog farms and the chicken farms that are up beyond Old Mill Bridge. It's a huge project. It's going to require lots and lots of money and a lot of environmental studies that involve the universities and big, huge grants. This is a small grant. This is not related to the big work that has to be done. So when that opportunity happens for the forum, it will be publicized. You will be invited as the public, and certainly you can participate in it. It's something that everyone who lives around here is concerned about, but it's not something that the CIB can correct with this project. They're two vastly different things.
Thank you for that, Barbara, for adding on to add a lot of important information to what I said. And I just want to say that we as an organization have been so impressed with the people who live on Derrickson Creek. People at SwannKeys, at the Refuge, at some of the other communities along the creek. You guys really have been at the forefront of pushing for some of these changes that need to be made to clean up the creeks. There's more activity down here in the Derrickson Creek area than in many other places in the Inland Bays, and we appreciate that.
John Elliott, Allen Drive. I've recently been made aware that out here are 3 buildable lots that we are holding for a crisis. How will this infringing on the grasses will make these lots unsellable in the future, and therefore we don't have that's a financial thing, and that might be a question for the board or others.
Yeah, are you referring specifically to the strip of land between the community
I'm not
center here
sure
and...
where we're going to do our work, yes.
Okay. Yeah, that was brought to my attention that might be a question. It's one that I can't necessarily answer. I did talk to our consulting firm about it, and they said if you really want to build something out there, a home right there, and I don't even know if there are utilities or sewer or anything else out there at the moment, but if you want to hold that as a buildable lot all the way up to the water's edge, that probably is not possible with this living shoreline design. You might be able to do that and just do the sides of the lagoon and not do anything on this side closer to the community center. But I think that's probably a larger question for your board to address, and we can bring in a consulting firm to talk about that more specifically if that's a real concern.
The one thing I have, getting back to the pesticide, Royal Lawn Care is who we use in here to cut our grass and our weeds. I have an MSDS sheet for the chemical that he's using. It's called Buccaneer currently. I'm going to hand it off to Chuck. But there is a natural thing that works really well. You take 1 gallon of white vinegar, 1 16-ounce bag of Epsom salts, and 1/3 bottle of original Blue Dawn. Mix them together and spray. It cost effective. It costs you about $4 versus $20 for Roundup.
So that's in your grass areas?
It's another alternative.
Yeah, I think what Bob was referring to was addressing herbicides within the water areas.
Yeah, and I'm not going to really get into that too much, but there are a number of home remedies, if you will, And all of that's considered an off-label use, that's fine to use. Um,
Okay, Janet Hoover, Canvas Back. I also want to thank you for your very comprehensive presentation. I find it very informative. I think it's a great idea. I think it would look beautiful out there, but I do have a question as to if the community decides to go ahead with this project from start to finish, what is like the time frame that it would take to do that?
Thank you for asking that, because I did neglect to address that. Typically, when we go for grants on these types of projects, the grant is awarded for a period of 2 years. So from the start of the money coming to us until we finish, we have 2 years to complete the project. Based on our experience with other projects like this one, once we get the grant money, we go into a final design mode, which means that the consulting firm, the engineers have to go out and collect more data from the site, surveys, and perhaps sediment testing, anything they need to apply for the permits that are required to do the project. And then they have to apply for the permits, and the state and the Army Corps of Engineers have to approve those permits. Typically, that process takes about 6 months. So during that 6-month period, it could extend a little bit more if we have to spend more time working with you to finalize the concept that you want to see. So I would say probably 6 to 8 months to get the final design put together with your help to gather all the data we need, apply for the permits, and get those permits approved. Once we get those permits, then we're good to go for constructing, and we would need to work with you to find the time of year that works best for you. You might want to do all of the construction work during the off-season when you have fewer residents here. That can certainly be done. We do it like maybe in the fall or late fall. Typically, the construction itself only takes 2 or 3 weeks at most. You know, they know what to do. They get out here with the equipment, and you know, time is money for these contractors, so they'll get in here and do the work and get out. The planting, normally we have to do the planting, or it's best to do the planting, I should say, in the early spring. So if we were to do the construction out here, say, in the fall, then we probably would have to wait until early spring, maybe March, April, to actually put the plants in the ground. And the reason we do that is that we want to maximize their rate of growth. We want to get them in at the best possible time so that by the end of the summer, we've got a full growth of plants out there. So based on our prior experience, these projects tend to take about 1.5 years to do. So we have the 6 to 8 months of design and permitting, construction, planting, and then we monitor them for a year after they're put in at least, just to make sure that things are working. If there are any tweaks we need to make, we have time to do those while we still have the grant funds available. So does that answer your question? Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I've been here since '79. Oh, Doris Sager on Canvas Back. I've been here since '79. I've been here, Doris Sager on Canvas Back. I have been here since '79. There has been very little that I can see maintenance done on the bulkheads on all 3 sides. Why couldn't this project be put down in the other end where the bay comes in rather than up here? We've got 3 available lots. If we need them for, if we have to have money for an emergency, or if we have to sell them, there's 3 available lots. If this thing goes in, bed goes in, we're going to lose those lots. How will that affect me if I'm halfway down the middle of this canal? The water's going to be coming in. It's still going to be coming in like it does now.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, this project will not clean up the water in all of the canals. It's just one small demonstration of a technique that could be used in some other areas. This particular marina here, because of its size and shape, is an especially good place to do this type of project because we have room to build out into the water there and plant into the water, create a tidal zone. In other places in the canals, you might have too narrow of an area. We don't want to impede any passage of boats and so forth. The reason that we chose this particular place is because of the size and shape of this particular square lagoon here. But our hope is that it could potentially be done in other areas, and certainly be willing to look at that possibility. But this is a sort of a unique opportunity here at your marina. But I appreciate your question. Thank you.
My name is Brad Tucker. I live on Pintail. My question is, what exactly is this going to cost us? Because it sounds like, and there's been a lot of misinformation, not on your part, but within the neighborhood, that it's only going to cost us $10,500. From everything I've seen here today, we don't really know what the cost is going to be. Is that right?
Well, the cost to your community would be whatever you are willing and able to put into the grant project as financial match. The amount that's been discussed previously over the last 6 to 8 months by your community members is that we could probably afford to put $10,500. So we would find the additional match required from other sources, if at all possible. So that's what currently I would anticipate your obligation would be, something on the order of that amount. If you had other funds available that you were willing to put into it to perhaps increase the project or improve the project in some way, then certainly we're not going to discourage you from doing that. But that would sort of be, in my mind, the minimum that we would expect from the community, and I think that would fly, that amount of money. You would need to do probably some maintenance on it in future years, just like you have to maintain anything else in your community. We expect that this type of project will require very little maintenance based on experience in other places. Like I said, some trash removal, replacing some plants occasionally. If we have adverse conditions that plants occasionally die, as they do anywhere else in your landscaping. And, over the longer term, within years, maybe you'll get a little bit of settling of some of the shoreline there, so maybe somebody will have to come in and do a little regrading or something to fill in some holes. But other than that, that's what we anticipate the maintenance would be, so whatever money would be required to do that amount of maintenance would be what you would need to make sure you had set aside in future years.
My name is Sandra Varga from Blueville. In light of the new federal government budget cutting practically every department, they're even cutting good departments because they found it was not efficient, which tells me that they're going to be giving less money to the states. How can you assure us that you will be able to get grants for us? And then I have a second question after that.
Okay, well, I can never guarantee 100% that we're going to be able to get a grant. We apply, along with many other people around the state, for any particular pot of money that's available, and we've had a lot of success previously in getting grants for these types of projects. Some of them haven't been successful, most of them have, but it depends on the amount of money available and the amount of competition for the money, as these types of things always do. In terms of the future outlook for money, that's hard to predict at this point. Currently, the state has money in these grant programs, and I think that the outlook, based on my executive director's discussions with the state, with the governor, and with the secretaries, is that over the next probably 2 years, there's going to be adequate money in these programs to continue these types of grants. After that, I'm not sure. It depends on the state budget. We would never start a project like this without the funds to finish it. If we apply for a grant and the grant is awarded, the money's there. The state has obligated that money to us. It's already set aside in escrow for us. So there's no chance that we would start a project and then the state run out of money and we only got halfway through it. That would not happen. But in terms of applying for a grant, it's competitive. Depends on other communities applying for it and how much money is available.
My second question would be is when we had a house brought in, a modular house brought in, we had to pay a certain amount of fee for the cover for the roads. In October, they talked about bringing several truckloads of concrete in to dump in for the Living Shores. how does that protect our streets that everybody else had to pay when they bought something heavy in it? Are you planning on paying to prepare, fix our roads if they crack them or whatever?
Well, that's certainly a consideration, and from an engineering point of view, I can't answer that question. I can certainly get an answer for that question. We would make sure that nothing we did damaged any of the infrastructure in your community. That's something that's always looked at when we do the final engineering designs. We have a similar question at Andover by the Bay, because they have a small bridge that goes over to the area where we want to construct a living shoreline in their community. And so the question came up, can this bridge take the weight of the truck that would have to go over it? And so we looked at that question and we decided, yes, it will. But we will need to know information like that and concerns like that so that we can address them. We'll make sure that nothing is damaged. Or if it is damaged, then the construction and consulting firms that we work with, they have the insurance to cover that kind of thing.
Ken Varga from Bluebill. One of the concerns that I have is that many people in this community have invested a lot of time and money and energy into the community, and because of the clear-cut, organized pattern that the community is, with the streets laid out as well as they are, and the clubhouse and the pool, and the common areas as beautiful as they are. You're asking us to revert back to a inland waterway design in the middle of a pretty clear-cut community outline. That's one of the things that would concern me also. The other object that I didn't realize is that the 3 community lots that are out here in front of the building here represent a sizable investment for the community association. In that even if they were worth $150,000 apiece, there's a $450,000 expense that we would be asked to give up. So this doesn't just cost us $10,000, it costs us over $400,000 for this. And if it were allowed to be reverted back to a bulkheaded lot, is that a possibility? And you're saying, no, it cannot be, and it
Well,
would not be.
Yeah, I'm sorry, probably what I said was a little bit misleading. It certainly would be possible to revert it back to a bulkheaded lot. What our consultant says probably is not possible is maintaining that size of lot all the way to the water's edge and accommodate a living shoreline. But if in the future you wanted to put a bulkhead back in, there's nothing that would prevent that from happening. That's certainly possible. And in terms of the look of it and so forth, those are decisions that you'll have to make as a community. I will get you whatever information you need to make that decision, to information on what it might look like and so forth, but those are decisions that you have to make.
The thing that I keep hearing and understand everything that you said today, that whatever, no matter what you do, you're not going to clean that water up.
We are not going to clean it up with one project, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't make small steps. This project is not going to work water quality. It may improve it slightly in this area of the lagoon.
So I think one thing that was missed was the bulkhead. And I think I understood, Mary Ann, that the bulkhead will be removed down to the top rail, and the old bulkhead remains in place in the mud, and that if we had to or wanted to reinstall the bulkhead, we would not need a DENREC permit because it's still there. Is that correct?
I don't know how to answer that question, honestly. I don't know the specifics of the permit. And I think how much of the bulkhead could be left would depend on the final design, how much grading has to be done. So how far back or how far into the water the project goes.
I'm Mark Simon, Campbell Center. One of my concerns is the financial aspect of this. Is that I've heard some information, and it sounded like they were going to say the cost of replacing the bulkhead. The fact is we're going to replace only one section of the bulkhead, so the cost avoidance would probably be in the neighborhood of 10K, because it's 20K, let's say, well, to replace it on the side of it, we say 10K. In the future, we're going to also negotiate a contract that says that there is maintenance responsibility on the part of SwannKeys lot owners, and there's also going to be a set of metrics that we're supposed to meet. And I also heard that there's a possibility that if we did not meet whatever metrics are devised, that we would have to pay back the grant. Is that correct?
That is not correct. No. No, the way these grants work is that the grant is awarded to build a project. As the project progresses and the consultants and construction companies send in their invoices, we send them over to the granting agency and they get paid. Once the project is in, there is nothing that will force you or the Center for the Inland Bays or anybody else to give back that money. The granting agency works with us to ensure the best possible chance for success of the project, but if for some reason metrics aren't met, well, that's part of the risk of putting in a project. The only thing that might trigger having to pay back some of the grant money is if one of the partners in the project, such as your community, if we got halfway through it and we decided, oh, we don't want to do this anymore, but we've already spent $30,000 on it, the state might have cause to come and demand some repayment of the funds that they put into it because there was no product from what they paid for. But once the project is done, I've never heard of any instance where grants have had to be paid back. That's misinformation.
Can we have one more question?
In regards to the question about the 3 possible building lots here, I seem to hear and understand that that possibility could still be viable if we did the east side and the west side.
I believe that's true.
And it seems to me that that's something that the board will look at in great detail, and you would still be open to doing the project that way.
We would be open to looking at that with our design engineers, absolutely.
Yeah, it might even be a little bit better, symmetrical, to have it that way than the L shape.
Yeah, the main reason that we wanted to do this upper side of the lagoon is that we can get the biggest marsh area in there and therefore get the most potential water quality and habitat benefit. So that, we always are in the business of getting the most out of the project that we can. So that's why we wanted to use that side. But it is potentially a viable option to do just those other sides. And if that's what fits best with the community's needs, then.
All right, well, I thank you all very much for coming and giving us the demonstration.
Hold on.
All right, when you all get through, please put your chairs back up on top of the table.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for asking us to come here and talk. I know that we have one more question over here, and I will certainly answer your question. I do want to mention that Bob Collins over here runs our oyster gardening program, and I know that a number of you have expressed interest in raising oysters off of your dock. If that's the case, please see Bob before you leave, and he can give you more information about that. Yes, sir.
I'll make it brief. John Vaughn, a resident full-time. Thank you for your presentation. It enlightened me. I'm personally, as a resident for the project, I just want the community to know, and you as a representative CIB, that the board of directors here is a 12-month volunteer service to the community, and it changes every year. So when this thing happens, through the process, if the community votes yes for it, it'll go into next year's board of directors agenda. As I understand, I'm speaking as a resident, but I'm also a board member, this sitting board has not vetted or approved or disapproved of this project. We're putting it out to the community for the community's intake. That's why they're here. So there shouldn't be any comments from any board members that should sway this one way or the other. We're all just residents down here, and we'd just like to keep it as that.
Understood. We
Thanks.
appreciate that. Again, if there's any additional information that your board or residents need, please let me know and I'll get it to you. Thank you so much for your attention.
Unfortunately, it could be a different method. Yeah, and it's good, right? And
I know that. I know that. You want $1? Yeah, they go.